Hi there, we're going to begin a look at the reproductive system, and we're going to divide this up into two parts, the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system. We're going to start with kind of the less complicated one as far as the reproductive process goes, the male reproductive system itself. And so we're going to take a quick look at some of the hormones involved. We'll also take a quick peek at the female here to begin with and kind of see the differences between male and female reproductive hormones and their control as far as the physiology goes. As far as the entire body is concerned, this one does have that caveat that it is not required for homeostasis. So this is reproductive system is a system required for reproduction, but not for essentially maintaining the homeostatic balance within the body itself. So everything that is here is geared towards the potential for reproducing another human. So male sex hormones. One of the major differences that we find between males and females in terms of their hormone levels as well as their production of things is that, in a sense, in the male, everything is constant. And so we have this relatively constant kind of dribble, in a sense, of sex hormones. And so the sex hormones, our testosterone, is being constantly released at a relatively constant level. They're continuing to come out, they're flowing, and they're just kind of creating a process where sperm production can be consistent all the time. There's no kind of variation in terms of things going up and down and up and down. Sperm production is basically just level, and it's level throughout the entire lifespan as well. And so there's very little dip even as a male gets older. Once puberty starts and begins, production of the hormones and the sperm cells are going to be roughly even throughout their entire life. Versus the female, where we have a cyclical process. And so the cyclical process is essentially geared towards the fact that, as far as reproduction in the female is concerned, it's designed to produce a single oocyte, make that oocyte ready for fertilization, and allow for that fertilization to occur one at a time. And so we're going to have the maturation of an egg. That process is going to begin at the beginning of the cycle, and then prepare essentially the uterus for implantation. So the endometrium is going to grow. We get this ovulation occurring where the egg is now ready, it's matured, it becomes ovulated, and either fertilization occurs, and if it doesn't, then menstruation begins. And so in terms of that, if as the hormones are kind of changing, if we had the same hormone level all the time and just had kind of constant egg production, we wouldn't have this ability to kind of alter things when pregnancy occurs. And so we need to be able to in a sense, start the process over and bring us back to the very beginning every single cycle. And if that cycle, in a sense, gets interrupted by implantation and fertilization, then the process is going to disrupt this kind of normal up and down cycle, and then the hormone levels are going to become relatively level, with the exception that we're going to inhibit the production of another matured oocyte at that point. So in the male, the process is, again, fairly constant. It begins with the hypothalamus, as many of our hormones do, as we saw back in the endocrine system. And so the hypothalamus is going to release a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone. And so this one really kind of tells us where it's going to go and what it does in terms of that. And so when we looked at things like the hormones before, we saw that gonado tells us that it's going to stimulate the gonads. And in terms of the hormone itself, it's also going to be, as it's a tropic hormone, it's going to tell us that we have something that is going to stimulate another endocrine organ. And so we're going to have other endocrine organ tissue stimulated by that gonadotropin releasing hormone. So gonadotropin releasing hormone goes down to the anterior pituitary. Once it gets to the anterior pituitary, that anterior pituitary is then going to be stimulated to release two hormones, FSH and LH. And so follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, both of which are basically named after the female side of the reproductive process, but they are also important here again for male reproduction. And so remember that in terms of the hormones, we saw them back in the endocrine system again. That follicle stimulating hormone is going to be geared towards the production of our sperm cells, and then luteinizing hormone going to be geared towards the production of hormone. So two different processes going on here, which means that we're going to have two different sets of cells involved in this process. So FSH is going to go down and stimulate our nurse cells, or Sertoli cells, kind of traditionally called. Interstitial cells are going to be stimulated by LH. My arrow got a little bit too far down there. So LH is going to be our interstitial cells, also known as Leydig cells. And as I said, FSH gives us the production of sperm, as well as the production of another hormone called inhibin. And so essentially, as this goes around, this is going to be a negative feedback loop, and that negative feedback loop is going to feed back in towards decreasing the amount of GRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone, which will then decrease our FSH, which then decreases our sperm. And so depending upon the amount of sperm that is, in a sense, ready in the system, that's going to dictate whether we need more production or not. With the interstitial cells, this comes down to our production of testosterone. And so that testosterone production is going to be there for everything from the production of sperm cells. So it's going to stimulate that production that is there. It's also going to stimulate the support of those cells during their reproductive process and forming those cells, as well as other things that testosterone does in terms of bone growth, muscle growth for the male as well. So the target of our FSH and LH is going to be the testes. And so a quick little review in terms of the testes. So there are two testes, the entire testis being a single one here, as far as the whole component that is there. We have then lobules with seminiferous tubules in them. And so we have several of those. Those seminiferous tubules are then going to feed into other tubules, and so we're going to get into the rete testes, and then eventually into the epididymis, where the sperm cells are then going to be stored. So they're going to be stored until ejaculation occurs, and then they'll head up through the ductus deferens or the vas deferens on their way out of the body. And so that production begins here in the seminiferous tubules themselves. Many, many loops of the seminiferous tubules as they sit in those lobules inside there. And if we were to take one single seminiferous tubule and cut it on a cross section here, we can see that we have a single cross section. It's surrounded by a basement membrane. So we have kind of a compartmentalization here of a single seminiferous tubule. That one seminiferous tubule then is on the inside. We have a number of developing sperm cells, and so they're making their way from the basement membrane towards the lumen. And so we have the lumen here in the inside, and then from that lumen they're going to travel all the way over to the epididymis. Surrounding that basement membrane, we have interstitial cells. Those interstitial cells are found in between all of our seminiferous tubules. And so those interstitial cells are found in between each one of those. That's where we're going to have the production of our hormones. This is where we're going to have that normal production of cells in between there. That's going to be stimulating the production of our sperm cells from all the way from the spermatogonia all the way to the mature sperm cells themselves. And we'll take kind of a closer look here at that process here. And so inside that seminiferous tubule, so outside of the cell we have our interstitial cells, our Leydig cells, and then on the inside we have our nurse cells. And so these nurse cells are relatively large cells. kind of cut through that one cell there, but so here we have our nurse cell. That nurse cell contains within there and kind of surrounded by them, we have our developing sperm cells. So beginning with a spermatogonium, that are going to make their maturation. And the whole job of those nurse cells is essentially protection, nourishment, for those developing cells. As they move from, down here would be the basement membrane, right down in this area here, and as they move through the spaces in between all of those nurse cells, they go from being less mature to more mature cells, to where by the time that they are released from the kind of the grips of the nurse cell there, they're then going to move out into the lumen. So over here we once again have the lumen of the seminiferous tubule. And that seminiferous tubule then travels down those cells, and they're going to make their changes as they make their way through. And so we have our basically fully developed sperm cell. That sperm cell is then going to make its way down into the epididymis and wait then at that point for the release through ejaculation itself. So all of these nurse cells are surrounding them. They're going to produce, as well as the sperm cells, they're also going to produce our inhibin. And that inhibin is then, as we get more and more of that cell production, and kind of as the system fills up, so to speak, with more and more sperm cells, more of that inhibin is then going to go and make its way back towards the hypothalamus. In a negative feedback process. So negative feedback is going to allow us to control how much of that hormone is needed at any given time, and allow for the control of normal sperm production. So as testosterone levels go up, so we get increased testosterone levels, we have increased amounts of inhibin. So that inhibin is going to feed back to the hypothalamus, and as it does so, that's going to decrease our amount of gonadotropin. And so our gonadotropin releasing hormone, as it falls down, that's then going to lead to a decrease in FSH and LH, and that's then going to lead to a reduction at that time. Overall, this kind of going back and going back leads us to basically a fairly constant level of the hormone. And so we have a very narrow margin in a sense of movement, and the average basically stays fairly constant. So with the release of more sperm cells, we get an increase a little bit in FSH and LH, and then as they're being stored and kept, then we get a decrease in the release of that FSH and LH as well, and that's going to slow down the production of the sperm cells. So this whole process is a big feedback loop, beginning up with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then says, okay, we need hormone, so it's going to release its gonadotropin releasing hormone. That's going to say go down to the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is then going to release its FSH and LH, and that's going to increase and move down to the testes. And then the testes are going to increase that's going to be a green light in a sense for increased sperm production, as well as an increase in production of and secretion of testosterone. Those are going to then release those hormones. We're going to have the production of sperm. We're going to have the support of the cells from those nurse cells that are there. And then as we get a rise in the levels of testosterone, a rise in the level of inhibin, those two hormones are then going to start to feedback, and we're going to get a negative feedback from testosterone and inhibin, and that's going to feed back up to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is then going to have a decrease in the amount of gonadotropin releasing hormone. And so we're going to decrease gonadotropin releasing hormone. That then slows down the production of FSH and LH, slows down the production of sperm cells, slows down the amount of inhibin and testosterone, and in a sense we start all over again. Now that those levels are laid down for a little bit, then they're going to be negatively fed back as well as the amount of testosterone and inhibin decreases. Then that feeds back to the hypothalamus to say, okay, we need more. And so as we have less of those two around, we're going to start that production and go round and round. And all of that leads to a relatively constant production of testosterone, constant production of inhibin, and a constant production of sperm cells. And so this process keeps on going all throughout the course of the life. And we'll see when we get into the female here that that process then changes for females, as we're going to have more of a cyclical process rather than just a linear one with males. And we'll talk about that next time.